Good morning, everyone. I think we're getting very close to getting started for our 2021 winter wheat meeting. Thank you all for being on here today. For those of you that have got your video on, give me a thumbs up if the audio sounds okay. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate that. Welcome you all in. We're really glad to see 2021. I think everybody is at this point in time. Certainly commodity prices look a little bit better. Our weather's a little bit of a challenge. We're going to get into some discussions of that. We've got a new format for you all that we're going to be working with today. And part of that format is we've asked our speakers to go ahead and record their presentations ahead of time. And that was simply to, we hope, facilitate better flow through of the meeting in this virtual format. We've got each of the speakers on. They're here, so if you want to send a question or two by chat during the presentation, feel free to do so. And it may even work out where those speakers can start answering some of those questions during the presentation if they wish. We are going to have a roundtable discussion with all of the speakers at the end. And so if you've got some questions that don't get answered during the meeting, we'll have an opportunity at the end that you can ask them all questions. We'll ask them at that point in time to turn their videos on so you can see each of them. And then you'll be able to either send questions in by chat, or if you raise a hand or something, we can probably give you access to where we can get your volumes turned on. You can ask questions that way. We appreciate each of you being here again. We appreciate working with you all throughout the course of the season. We had a decent start to the wheat crop, and so hopefully some of the discussion today will be valuable to you as well. We're currently also streaming this live on Facebook over at the Kentucky Grains Facebook page. So if you have a problem with this site for some reason, you can jump over there. We're going to leave it up on that Facebook site so you have access to it, and then we'll probably put it onto a Grains YouTube site later in the week. We've got one more of these meetings coming up, and that's on Friday. And so we're looking forward to seeing you come back on Friday as well. Anyhow, so with that, let's see, what else am I forgetting to talk to you all about? If you haven't done so already, most of you are, go ahead and put your name and location in the chat box. That just lets us know you're here. That helps us out a little bit with some of the CCA credits and some things like that. At the end, we'll put up a thing that you can click on to confirm your CCA attendance and credit. And so we'll put that up at the end as well. I think I have hit most of the highlights. We're going to start out with an introduction from Dr. Eli Capilouto. Dr. Capilouto is the president of the University of Kentucky. And since our efforts with the Grain and Forage Center of Excellence and some of your support in that area, he's gotten to learn a lot more about agriculture, and I think that's a good thing for all of us. I know he's been very impressed with the meetings that he's been involved with, and so thankfully he was willing to do this introduction for us. Something we probably couldn't do in person, a little bit harder for him to do it, and go from there. So the one thing I do need to make a mention of is when I sent in the request of, hey, could you come and talk to us and give an introduction, I called it a field day, not the winter wheat meeting. And so I just got slipped up in my request and called it a field day. So you're going to hear him mention field day in his introduction. And frankly, I may go back into the website and change this from a meeting to a field day just to work with Dr. Capilouto on that. So with that, I am going to start the first video. A couple of y'all that got your screens up, give me a thumbs up if the volume and such come through okay.
Hello, I'm Eli Capilouto, president of the University of Kentucky. Although we cannot gather in person for Wheat Field Day, I am reminded what this public health crisis has taught us. We can overcome and accomplish great things when we work together. Nowhere is that more evident than in the work that the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food, and Environment's Wheat Science Group does in partnership with farmers, communities, and our agricultural stakeholders. Wheat is a vital crop to Kentucky, improving soil health, economic vitality, and high-quality agricultural products like pastries, biscuits, cakes, and other foods. UK's Wheat Science Group works at the leading edge to develop wheat varieties for our climate and providing the best information to farmers. And they do this interdisciplinary work with you, working hand in glove with producers, crop consultants, and county agents. We are grateful for your partnership and appreciate the support of the Seymour Milling Company, the Kentucky Small Grain Growers, and farm families who play a critical role in this work. You are what it means to be the University of, for, and with Kentucky, fulfilling our mission to serve the Commonwealth. Thank you for joining us, and enjoy Virtual Wheat Field Day.
All right. With that, again, we appreciate President Capilouto jumping on and helping us out with this. One of the things that works out for a virtual field day that would have been very tough for him to do had we have been in person. And so with that, our first presentation that we're going to get into in terms of the production is the condition of the current wheat crop. And Dr. Carrie Knott, who's based out in Princeton, does a lot of work in small grains, got her PhD in wheat breeding, is going to talk some about the current crop condition and where we think that might set us up going into 2021. Sound good on the first video? Yes, no?
This is Carrie Knott with the University of Kentucky. I'm the Grain Crops Extension Agronomist. I'm going to spend just a couple of moments discussing the current condition of our winter wheat crop here in Kentucky. Thankfully, what I'm hearing from agents and producers, and also what I'm seeing across the state, is some very good winter wheat stands, similar to those in this photograph. And what you'll see here is that we have very good tillering per seed, a very lush stand, dark green, and so this is exactly an ideal stand of wheat going into winter dormancy. And so there are some producers that have reported some challenges getting winter wheat within the preferred planting window. And for those producers, whatever the delay may have been caused by, whether it be illness, equipment problems, resources, and also weather conditions, any of the wheat that got planted just a little late seems to be struggling just a bit. And this is more of a visual issue at this point. It's similar to what I'm showing here in that it's sort of thin stands. There's not a whole lot of tillers. You can see that there are a decent amount of stems, but far cry from the lush sort of stands that we would like going into winter dormancy. However, for those producers that had to plant late, either all or a portion of their crop, don't lose hope. As always, winter wheat is a very resilient crop. It's hard at this stage to really count it out. For those wheat fields that did enter winter dormancy with a little bit of a thin stand like this one shown here, don't despair. We do have options. Prior to Feeks 3, just prior to Feeks 3 or green up in the spring, what you'll want to do is go out and count the number of plants per square foot. If you have less than 70, you probably want to consider a split application of nitrogen. And for the first application at Feeks 3, you will likely want to apply half of your nitrogen. The remaining half of your nitrogen, you're going to want to apply around Feeks 5. This differs from a normal split application where you put on a third at Feeks 3 and 2/3 at Feeks 5. However, this elevated application of 50% at Feeks 3 will help with promoting some tillering early in the spring and therefore possibly help mitigate any yield loss due to these thin stands going into winter dormancy. Other than that, I'm very optimistic for this year's season. I'm hopeful that we will have a bin busting year, and I do very much look forward to our winter wheat production year and getting back out in the field. Thank you very much. This has been Carrie Knott with the University of Kentucky. This is Carrie Knott with the University.
Okay, so that was Carrie's quick overview of the current condition of the crop. I don't see any questions in the chat box currently for Carrie. So what I think I will do is we will jump from Carrie directly into the economics of wheat, and that's Dr. Jordan Shockley. And if you, this one, the audio is a little bit lower, so you may need to turn up your volumes when you go into this presentation.
Good morning. Welcome to the 2021 Winter Wheat Meeting. My name is Dr. Jordan Shockley, Associate Extension Professor, here to discuss the economics of the winter wheat crop for 2021. Today's discussion, we're going to touch on wheat marketing, looking at current futures prices as of December 17th. We're going to discuss some returns to storage and then quickly touch on a wheat management strategy for improved profits for the 2021 wheat crop. So if we look at where we are today as of December 14th, if you look back at mid-September, prices of wheat actually started to increase pretty drastically over concerns of tightening global supplies, up to about, peak at roughly $6.30 a bushel around mid-October. And then actually prices started to decrease a little bit after reports of Russia increasing their grain export quota, along with good cropping conditions in the US and actually bumper crops of wheat in Australia and Canada. And so as of Friday, the new WASDE report came out and reported slightly smaller supplies of US wheat and looking at higher exports leading to lower ending stocks, which led to this price rally we've seen over late Friday, early today on December 14th. In those reports, they also had world consumption increasing, led by China and Pakistan, really driving those imports and purchases of wheat. So there looked to be, if you capitalized, excellent pricing for our 2021 wheat crop. If you were able to capture that above $6 mark that the markets provided, put you in a great position coming into 2021. Now, if we look at prices, again, we are well above the 3-year average for wheat prices, some that we haven't seen in decades. So again, very good pricing opportunities here, which is set well for profitability for 2021 wheat. Couple that with historical positive basis, especially for holding some grain locally, roughly 10 to 20 cents above positive basis there at some of our local elevators here. Here we have Hopkinsville Elevator and Christian County Grain. I know a lot of our folks do sell to our Seymour Milling, and so I don't have that data currently available to me, but I provided some comparables here at Hopkinsville in Christian County. So looks like we're going to have great prices. Couple that with positive local basis, and if you look back in time since 2015, this is some data from our Kentucky Farm Business Analysis program from the Pennyroyal region. We've had pretty great the storage. That's that bottom number right there. And the 5-year average, looking at roughly 42 cents returns to storage, but all the way peaking at 2016 of almost $1.20. And so it looks like we're going to have some favorable prices again with some opportunities to store. So given that, really understanding your cost of production, especially going into this cropping season with favorable prices, it really looks like profitability is going to be very optimistic for 2021, especially if you locked in even above that $6 price. So here's an enterprise budget that's available from our Ag Econ Extension website. I'll provide that link to the left. And if you're looking at 80 bushel wheat average at $6 a bushel and 45 bushel soybeans at $10 a bushel, you're looking at returns above variable cost, almost reaching that $300 an acre area. And this is for rented crop ground. So you can see, I'll highlight here really quick for you, this cash rent of $165 an acre. If you owned crop ground, you could just add $165 to that returns above variable cost. So again, if we're looking at double crop wheat and beans for this year, very, very favorable and very optimistic for returns above variable cost this year. So given returns to storage, as I mentioned before, being positive, we conducted some studies early in partnership. Some of you may have seen this before in a previous year's presentation, but given the high prices we are seeing right now in the wheat markets, obviously as prices change, our management strategies may change along with it. So we did a study back in 2018, 2019, looking at planting and harvesting timings. We did that in Princeton, Kentucky, and we had different planting dates for wheat and soybeans. So obviously, if you're planting soybeans earlier, that means you're going to be harvesting later, or you're going to be harvesting wheat earlier than normal. So again, we've got various planting date and wheat harvest combination, as well as looking at storage and drying at 5 cents a bushel point removed. And given this year's prices, we're going to use $10 a bushel for soybeans and $6 a bushel for wheat. And we're going to be looking at dockage for grain moisture test weights and DON. So if you look at a partial budget for these strategies, you can see the combination here. We used October planting of wheat with normal harvest timing, which you can see is around July 1st in the study, as our base. That's why it's 0 net returns, and we're comparing all the other strategies to this base. And if we look at October planting and early harvest, you see here we have a net returns of a little bit over $50 an acre, improved profits from harvesting wheat early, and therefore planting soybeans earlier and getting this $10 or 10 bushel per acre bump in yields. So again, if you saw this presentation about a year ago, this was roughly $30 an acre. So given where price expectations are going into 2021, this strategy even improves profits even more. So something to think about come May, June timeframe, thinking about harvesting early and getting those beans planted early. Looking at some risk analysis, it looks like this strategy has roughly a 60% chance of paying off, above zero net returns. Expectation for this early harvest and storage and drying. So in summary, wheat prices are favorable going into 2021. Really good profitability, and it's encouraging for our 2021 wheat double crop soybean systems here in the state. Go ahead, use those enterprise budgets. Make sure you understand your cost of production so that you know what price expectation you need to shoot for covering at least variable costs. But it looks like this year, with a sound marketing strategy, there are plenty of opportunities to lock in prices well above those to cover variable cost. So go ahead and get locked in and use a sound marketing strategy to have some good profits this year. In addition, this early wheat harvest and drying is promising management strategies to improve profitability for 2021. Trying to get in there, harvest early if the weather permitting, and get soybeans planted to potentially gain 10 bushels on your soybean crop, double crop soybeans this year. So with that, I appreciate the time. Have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Provide my contact information there as well as my website, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
All right, first, let me apologize for letting the screen go blank there for a little bit. I'm not sure what button I hit, but I did something that that blanked out the video there for a moment. And thank you to all of you who sent me texts and even a phone call to let me know that something wasn't right. So I appreciate that. And Jordan, I apologize on that aspect of it. That was not intentional. I do have a question for Jordan, and that is, obviously he recorded this ahead of time. So Jordan, since you've recorded this, have you seen any major changes or shifts in the market?
Yes. As we look back at, I guess it's December 14th when this was recorded, if anyone's been paying attention to the markets, I pulled it up this morning and we're on one heck of a rally and have been since the recording. And so when we did this, it was $6 wheat, and now we're at $6.54 as of this morning for May. So it's one of those years where you're thankful. We've got great prices and profitabilities. I mean, if you've held out and still have some bushels to lock in, 650 is I wouldn't hold back for more, because this is looking really good right now. So very promising. It's always great to see this, especially over the past years we've had. And not only wheat, we've had rallies in corn and beans, and it's been a crazy ride here recently. And a lot of that's driven by weather expectations out of South America. And some of that's spilling over to the wheat market as well. And so, yeah, it's been great.
All right. Well, we are a little bit ahead of schedule, but that's okay. We will jump into our next presentation. Let me double check that for myself. Oh, this is a good one. Who here today would agree that we've been a little bit wetter than normal the last few years? I think we've all seen that we've gone through quite a bit of weather differences here the last few years. And I think Matt Dixon with our UK Ag Weather Center is going to go over some of these historical perspectives on our climate. And one question that I deal with a lot with farmers is, do we just happen to have 5-6 years that have been wetter than normal put together? Or is this a trend of what's coming in the future? If it's just a weather blip, there's not much I can do to manage it year to year. If this is a trend, then there are some things I can do differently. And so I think Matt's going to get into some of that with his presentation. Hopefully the screen stays up the entire time on this one and the volume stays good. If there's a problem, I'll keep my phone close by and you all give me a shout.
All right, I have a lot to go over, so let's get right to it. My name is Matt Dixon. I've been a meteorologist with the UK Ag Weather Center for about 8 years now. Over that 8-year time span, I've seen a shift in our climate here in the lower Ohio Valley, trending wetter and warmer than normal over the past several years. I'm going to talk about some of those changes in the presentation today and hope to prompt some thoughts into how these changes could impact your farm management and production practices into the future. So ultimately, as you all know, accurate long-range forecasts can be lacking, and predictability will always be limited in some capacity. Something that is not currently lacking is climate data here in the state. We have a number of resources to access years of data to show any trends, or in the case of the May freeze last year, outliers. I wrote about this topic in the September issue of the UK Wheat Science newsletter, but have since added some info taking into account data from 2020. While I'm gearing the presentation primarily toward the production of winter wheat, this info could also prompt some thoughts on other crop production, such as corn, beans, fruit crops, etc. Throughout, I'll be focusing on two main environmental conditions that play the largest factor into the success or failure of a crop, and that's precip and temperatures. So to start out, let's take a look at state average temperature over the past 125 years. Based on the trend line, we've had a number of cooler and warmer periods over the past century. But as you can see on the chart, we've been on the upward trajectory over the past 20 to 30 years. If we include the preliminary data from 2020, we have now seen 6 straight years where the state annual temperature average has ran above normal. If we go back a little further, 8 of the past 10 years have ran above normal also. So looking at the graph, you really have to go back to the 1930s to find a period of warmth that is comparable to what we're seeing now. But as we see in the next slide, we've actually been running warmer than the 1930s. So in this chart, I listed the top 10 warmest years in Kentucky. The exceptional warm year of 2012 that accompanied the drought shows up at number 2. And since then, we've had 3 additional years added to the top 10 in 2016, 17, and 2019. They're at number 8. What makes this data especially significant is the fact that our climate record runs back into the late 1800s. So over 125 years, we've seen 4 of our warmest years on record in the past decade. I'll repeat that again. We've seen 4 of our warmest years on record in the past decade, with data going back to the late 1800s. So lastly, looking there at the bottom, preliminary data from 2020 shows the state temperature average at 57.2 degrees, above normal yet again, and would be around the 15th warmest year on record. So the warm trend continues. Now, taking a look at precipitation, you once again see that uphill climb over recent years. Just as a case in temperatures, we are also seeing much more in the way of precip as of late. We averaged over 64 inches in 2011. You can see that spike there. That was followed by a dry 2012, but looking more recently, including 2020, we have now gone 6 straight years with the state average running above normal. So before I go any further, I thought this would be a good time to talk about the word normal. What is a normal? A normal is essentially the average climate conditions over a 30-year period. These normals are updated every 10 years. Our current normals are based on the years 1981 through 2010, but these will be updated to the 1991 to 2020 normals at some time this year. Here's a look at normal precip for the year and seasons for different locations across the state. Based on those 81 to 2010 normals, the state as a whole averages 47.9 inches per year. But as you can see from the map, northern Kentucky is closer to 42, 43 inches a year, while southern and western Kentucky are closer to 50. So when we compare to normal, how significant has the state annual average been over the past several years? Since 2011, we've seen 4 of our wettest years on record. 2011 tops the chart with 64.35 inches. 2018 isn't too far behind. 2019 comes in at number 5 all time. Once again, this record extends back over 125 years. Looking at the preliminary data for 2020, we sit at 58.17 inches, which would add yet another year to the top 10 list in the past decade. 58.17 would sit there as the new number 8. So, looking spatially across the state, the trend of above normal rainfall has also been spatially distributed across the state. The bar chart shows the annual precip deviations from normal for each year between 2011 and 2019 for the state, and 4 climate divisions, including western, central, eastern Kentucky, and the bluegrass region. Since the dry year in 2014 and a slight dip for western Kentucky in 2017, each climate division has consistently seen precip run above normal. And as a side note, I don't have 2020 on here, but I did look at it, and preliminary data does suggest all climate divisions ran above normal in 2020 also. So those bars on the positive side continue. So as you can imagine, the wet pattern has reduced the intensity and longevity of drought across our area, which is seen in this time series graphic from the U.S. Drought Monitor. Just as an example, on reading this graphic, about 20% of Kentucky was experiencing extreme drought around the start of July in 2012. You can see that red color representing extreme drought diminish as you get later in the summer and early fall and conditions improve. So since that drought, we've seen some very short-lived droughts here in Kentucky. They have been impactful, but mostly short-lived. Most notably in 2016, when we were dealing with wildfires in eastern Kentucky, and September 2019, when the state saw its driest September on record. So that year, we averaged 0.22 inches for the month here in Kentucky. And if we take that wet pattern into account we've seen recently, this month, the dry month of September, was then actually followed by 13 straight months of above normal rainfall. So definitely a wet pattern in place. So bottom line, it has been very warm. It has been very wet as of late on an annual basis over the last several years. Has that been the trend among all the seasons, winter, spring, summer, and fall? In the next several slides, we'll take a look at some temperatures and precip time series scatter plots, looking at annual and seasonal data across the state between the years of 1981 and 2020. So just to start off, I have the annual data plotted here. In these plots, I'm essentially placing the year where the average temperature on the x-axis meets the annual precipitation on the y-axis. So just an example, let's look up there at 2019 upper right. The state annual average temperature sat at 57.5 degrees that year, and precipitation was a little over 61 inches, which places the XY coordinates up there in the upper right-hand corner. In addition to plotting the years, I also divide the data into 4 boxes based on the 1981 to 2010 annual temperature and precip averages, which are shown by the brown and blue lines. In the end, the 4 boxes can then be classified in different ways. The box in the upper left-hand corner would contain any years that saw above normal precip and below normal temps. The upper right would have years that saw both above normal precip and temps. The bottom left would have years with below normal precip and temperatures, and the bottom right is years with below normal precip and above normal temperatures. So I put all the years on here going back to 1981, and I highlighted the last 5 years in red, which have all fallen in the box designating above normal precip and temperatures up there in the upper right. So real quick, how does this data look when looking at the individual seasons across Kentucky? Ultimately, above normal precip and temps are distributed throughout the year. To make it easier, I went by the meteorological seasons, Here's a look at the winter months of December through February. After the cool and drier winter season of 2014 and 15, we've ran warmer and wetter than normal the past 5 years. Just looking at the past winter in 2019-20, we saw our second warmest winter since 1981, just behind 2016-17. So going on to the spring months of March through May, we are still running above normal for the most part in both categories, despite being closer to normal. This trend of years staying mostly in the top right box continues into the summer months and into the fall. Take a look at summer real quick here. We did have 1 year in 2017 that saw below normal temperatures, but above normal precip. But for the most part, they stay up there in the upper right-hand corner. And now we look at fall. And the one main exception here in fall came in 2016 when we saw below normal precip with the drought that year. So all in all, though, you see that the trend throughout all the graphs over the past 5 years, we've been running above normal in precip in temperature, not only on the annual scale, but also on the seasonal scale. So next, I want to take a deeper look into temperatures over the first 5 months of the year. In recent years, you've probably seen wheat coming out of dormancy a bit earlier in the year, and by taking a look at growing degree day accumulations, we can see why that may be the case. Most are familiar with the term growing degree days, but if not, we are essentially taking temperature and relating it to the growth and development of a particular crop, in this case, wheat. In calculating growing degree days, we take the average temperature for the day and subtract a base temperature, which is the minimum temperature required for growth of that specific crop. In this case, I used 32 degrees as a base temperature, which was based on a paper from Dr. Knott and her colleagues from 2016. So in the graph, I include the growing degree day accumulations for each year between 2011 and 2020 for Lexington, starting from January 1st and extending through May 31st. When we see the line increase, we are looking at warmer temperatures and ensuing growth and development. When the line levels off, we are seeing very little or even no development if it falls flat, which is the case for January most of the time. Looking at the graph, it is a bit hard to gather much info other than 2017, that yellow line, which ran considerably warmer during the winter months, taking rather significant jumps over the latter half of January and February and early March. Highs that year were in the 50s and 60s. They were common, even hitting 79 degrees in Lexington on February 24th. Anyways, I take you to the next graphic, which is the same graph, but I just changed the colors of the lines. 2016 through 2020, I changed the color to red. Well, 2011 to 2016, I turned it to blue. What was the major difference? For the most part, the latter 5 years of 2016 to 2020 are showing more accumulated growing degree days by the time early March rolls around. So now let's take a look at Paducah for the same period. Again, you see 2017 take quite the jump early in the year. You see 2020 actually was running pretty close to it there for a while. But now looking at the color change, you see the same general trend as Lexington, with the last 5 years running ahead of the previous 5 years, with the exception of one, which was 2012. So this has ultimately been due to the warm winters we've had as of late. 4 of the warmest winters on record have came within the past decade. The winter of 2016-17 was actually our second warmest ever on record, very warm that year. You see our past winter of 2019 and 20 actually sits there at number 5 now. So looking at the next graphic, this has been the case among all climate divisions over the past 5 winters. Our last cold winter came in 2014-15 when we saw multiple heavy snowfall events, and they were followed by Arctic air pushes, which pushed temperatures below zero at times. Overall, these warmer winters have progressed wheat development a little more rapidly and led to more advanced growth stages a little earlier in the year. I know we've talked about in recent years, especially 2017 and earlier this past year in 2020, refreshing my memory for those years. I read some articles from UK that say wheat had reached jointing in 2017 by the end of February. And in 2020, wheat was beginning to head in early to mid-April. So not good for the crop. I think it turned out all right in 2017, but obviously not the case last year. So this takes me to my next slide. What does the rest of winter look like this year? Are we tracking on the same path? Are we trending warmer and wetter than normal? So that looks to be the case. Here's a look at the 3-month outlooks produced by the Climate Prediction Center. These outlooks are available on our website if you ever want to look at them at weather.uky.edu. We have temperature on the left and the precip outlook on the right. When looking at this map, we are more or less looking at a forecaster's confidence in above, near, or below normal precip and temperatures over that time span. The darker the shade of color, the higher the confidence. In this case, we are looking at the 3-month outlooks for January through March. Right now, the CPC is leaning toward another warm and wet winter for Kentucky. Something to note is while these are showing above normal temps and precip, this doesn't mean we won't have some periods of cold or dry conditions. Overall, this map is just showing how the average will end up over that 3-month period. So next, I want to talk about frost and late spring freezes, specifically looking at climatologies for various locations across the state. As I referenced earlier, we saw the late freeze in early May of last year when the state dipped into the 20s across central Kentucky and points to the east, resulted in damage to wheat across the area. I remember looking at, based on yield estimates from the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, 2020 yields were about 13 bushels down 18. So just looking at that May freeze, they are rare. May freezes are rare here in Kentucky. In this table, I listed the last date of spring freeze for 5 locations across the state. I highlighted the dates in red if they fell in May. All in all, over the past 20 years, this has been a rarity, even never happening for Paducah and Bowling Green airports. The northern latitude makes areas in northern Kentucky a little more susceptible, but looking at Lexington before 2020, you have to go back to 2005 to find the last time we dropped to freezing in May. So looking at temperatures like we saw in the 20s this past year becomes even rarer. Just some stats I have written down from the paper I wrote in September. Lexington hasn't dropped to 30 or below in May since 1966. That's 30 degrees or below. Bowling Green hit 30 on May 3rd or May 1st of 1963. Paducah has never hit 30 degrees or below in May. So bottom line, I'm not ruling out another May freeze, but just saying they simply don't happen very often here in Kentucky, especially below 30 degrees. So just looking at the typical occurrences of spring freeze, here's a chart I put together for another publication. The source there at the bottom if you want to take a look at it. For each of the stations, you can get a look at frost freeze stats based on the 1981 to 2010 climate normals. Most of the time, our average last freeze in Kentucky is typically over the 2nd or 3rd week of April. In the case of Lexington, it falls on April 14th, looking down from 50%, while Paducah is on April 8th. When looking at the dates under 90 and 10%, you can read the graph as 90% of the time, the last freeze will occur after that date. So as an example, looking at Bowling Green, 90% of the time, the last freeze will occur after March 25th and 10% of the time after April 25th. So that just goes to show you right there, 10% of the time, the last freeze occurs after April 25th. So the May event this year was very rare. So with that, I want to close with a couple comments. First, if you ever need help getting climate data, just have some general weather questions or want to follow up on this presentation, feel free to contact me anytime. I have my email listed below, matt.dixon@uky.edu. Secondly, some of the info I covered today is offered in a monthly webinar series hosted by the Kentucky Climate Center titled Kentucky Monthly Climate Perspective on Drought and Hydrologic Conditions. Each webinar focuses on the climate conditions over the past month, outlooks moving forward, and any impacts related to ag or water supplies. So this is free to attend. for anyone that wants to join, and is streamed live via Zoom or YouTube on the first Thursday of every month, 2 p.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Central. So in the lower right-hand corner, in case you do want to register for the Zoom calls, please contact us at one of the following email addresses, and we'll make sure to get you set up. Usually I'll retweet this on my Twitter account, but if you don't have Twitter, please email us and we'll get you set up. And with that, I'm going to end it there and wish everyone a successful 2021 growing season. Thank you. All right, I have a lot to
Okay, there was a lot that Matt put into that presentation. Matt is on here, and we've got a little bit of time. So if somebody wants to shoot a question either by chat or probably chat's going to be about the easiest way to do it. So if you want to stick a question in there while we got a minute or two, feel free to do that. I had several people sending me texts, Matt, and I got some private chats of, wow, that's interesting. Oh, that's good data a couple different times throughout. So I think particularly where you had the reds and blue showing the last 5 years or so versus the previous 5, shows what we all think we knew, and that is that we seem to be trending toward a quicker accumulation of heat units when it comes to the wheat crop, and that's probably what got us in trouble with these freezes these last couple of go-arounds. That you combine that with some historically late freeze events, and that ends up being a really bad combination on the crop as a whole. So here's a couple coming in for you.
Let's
you
see.
go.
Do you have charts showing variance in rain by season and region? In those scatter plots, I went by season. That could be something I could incorporate into a regional aspect. But by and large, the regions and the seasons are both showing a above normal trend in precip the past 5-6 years. And to go along with that, temperatures also. So it's definitely been warmer and wetter here in Kentucky. But I'll look and see if I can make a graph showing that variance by season and region. But have you compared between the 2000s versus 1950s or earlier?
I'm guessing that's growing degree days there. That's my guess there, Matt.
I have not. That's something I could take into account. Is there a versus 1950s or earlier? I'll put this information into a chart, and I'll send it to Chad, see if we can send it out to everybody. I know I put together a lot of information earlier. I couldn't include everything, but this is some good input on some ideas I could do in the future. So
really good stuff. And again, Matt's going to stick around for the roundtable session as well. And Matt gets this right up to schedule. So we're going to jump right back into our next talk, which is Carrie Knott again, talking about maximizing yield, despite some of these challenges that we've been facing with weather at the moment. So we're going to pull hers up. Matt, thanks again. And we'll see you at the roundtable discussion as well.
Hello, this is Carrie Knott with University of Kentucky. I'm the Grain Crops Extension Agronomist. Today we're going to talk about how we can maximize wheat yield despite Mother Nature. So as we all know, weather conditions play a very dominant role in our grain crop production. Whether it be flooding, and this is one of my favorite pictures. I received it several years ago from an ag agent in Livingston County, and it was an image of him canoeing his soybean field. And so, believe it or not, there are soybeans underneath those lily pads. And although we do not often canoe our soybean or winter wheat fields, it is one aspect that we do have to contend with as a possible weather condition. Another one is drought. So this image obviously was not taken here in Kentucky. It was taken in Phoenix, Arizona area. But it highlights the fact that if we do not have a good seed bed, we're going to have some problems with seed establishment, seed placement, and seedling germination. And so really getting those conditions right is important. And I think one of the year in, year out weather conditions that wheat producers have to contend with is the possibility of a spring freeze and some sort of damage to their wheat crop based upon that. And so given recent conditions, what we've found is that the winter temperature, if we look at the last 10 years, and this is courtesy of Matt Dixon with the UK Ag Weather Center, out of the last 10 years, 7 of those years have been warmer than average. And you can see that in 2012, 13, 16, 17, and so on have been much warmer than normal. And this has made it very interesting in terms of wheat production in Kentucky. Not only have they been warmer, but of these years, of the last 10, 4, and quite possibly 5 for this past year, have set records for the top 10 warmest winters since records have been kept back to 1895. So this illustrates the fact that our winters seem to be trending warmer, which Matt will talk about or has talked about. But it also provides us concern in terms of spring freezes. And so if we look at the years that we have had spring freezes, you'll see that 3 of those 7 years, 12, 17, and of course 2020, we did have severe spring freezes. But just because it's a warmer than normal year does not mean we will have the conditions that will be conducive for a spring freeze. And so several of those years did not have a spring freeze. But what if we do? How do we mitigate for a spring freeze? Is there really anything we can do? Seems like the damage is done, right? Well, that's not quite the case. I think one way that we can mitigate damage is with variety selection. And I think variety selection is a very underrated way to mitigate our risk of spring freeze year in and year out here in Kentucky. So this image came from Ag Communications from Matt Barton of the wheat breeding crew harvesting their plots in Woodford County near Versailles. And I just think it was a great visual to talk about variety selection and how to reduce our risk of spring freeze. So these ultra early or early heading varieties may seem great in terms of a double crop soybean production, but they're really prone to spring freeze. And that's because a lot of these ultra early and early varieties actually insensitive to photoperiod. So what they do is when they get enough warm temperatures, they're going to bolt. And so that growing point is going to go above ground. And so often in Kentucky, that'll be in the late winter or early spring when we don't want them to. And so it's much safer for us here in Kentucky to get those mid to late heading date varieties so that they do not have that potential for bolting too soon. However, there are many producers that like a range of maturity groups. And why do they like this? Because it kind of spreads their risk, right? And so should you be interested in these ultra early or these early heading varieties, go ahead and plant those last. It's not that they can't be used here in Kentucky, but they're much safer when they're planted later in the season, past October, maybe late October, early November, if you have some sort of delayed planting date. And again, this is because of the risk of spring freeze. It's not that they won't do well or yield well, but in years that we do have spring freezes, you can see that the lines, say Truman and the Syngenta line, which are very late maturing, late heading date varieties, yielded most. And then the lines that have the shortest heading date, they're closer to the left, actually had the least yield. And that totally is a function of these early maturing, early and ultra early maturing varieties really got hammered by the spring freeze in 2020, whereas Truman and some of these later lines did not. And so I'm very grateful for Bill Bruning with the wheat variety trial for putting this out and allowing me to use this graphic because it's really good information for our producers to have. And so when we're talking about freeze damage, we run the gamut of sort of normal spring freezes that occur right at bolting, where you see that the top one is damaged and the bottom one, or the one on the right, is very glossy, and so it hasn't been damaged. And so in the last 10 years, we've had 3 different freeze events. And of those freeze events, we have run the gamut of from stem elongation from about Feeks 4 to 5 all the way up to full flowering. And so that gives us a good way to see what this yield loss is going to be like. Some more typical sort of freeze damage imagery is sort of these blasted heads or these deformed heads, and this is a totally typical freeze damage. Freeze damage can also like bleach them out, and so sometimes if you're not careful, you might mistakenly cause this fusarium head blight damage, but it is not. You can tell by color and some other aspects that this was just a very severe freeze event. And of course, I know this is not wheat, it is barley, but it was a striking image. Some more less striking symptomology for freeze is sort of stem splitting. And so this happened last year. I also observed it in 2017. I'm told by Dr. Lloyd Murdoch this occurred in the 2012 freeze as well. And what happens is these stems get brittle. And so where they got froze, they tend to get discolored, and it's a very slight discoloration. It's very hard to see. But there's also kind of striations that occur in the stem as well. And if you touch them, they're very brittle, and you can see my fingernail is kind of into the stem here. And what happens is it just breaks open. The stem breaks open. And this is if you kind of physically do that yourself. In other cases, you know, the wind might blow some stems over and you might just see some heads knocked over like this. And so very typical freeze damage. What was atypical last year is that we saw this later on in a lot of incidents. So I saw a lot of these heads, these stems without heads near harvest. And so typically you don't see that. We saw it last year. Some other atypical freeze symptomologies that we may encounter is sort of this discoloration. And so you'll see the head on the left looks just off. It's just a little too bright. And actually that did sustain freeze damage. The one on the lower right did not sustain freeze damage. And the damage that the one on the left received was that basically the anthers and the stigmas got killed by the freeze event. And so what happened was the plant sensed that there was no place to put its photosynthate. And so I'm assuming it just terminated any resources going to that plant. And so what you'll find is that those kind of stall out and just kind of remain in the lower canopy. This past year in 2020, it is very unusual. However, we did get some freeze damage very late in the season. You can see here some spike damage on the heads where it actually turned the color to white and sometimes that red depending on variety. You can also see where the seed stopped setting. And so you can see in the middle, sort of in the middle where you see kernels, developing kernels, and that's because those probably were pollinated a few days before the freeze hit. And you can see on the tips these sort of aborted kernels and dead anthers because they're white rather than yellow. And what this means is that there's not going to be any seed produced down there, and that this freeze event occurred just a couple of days after the healthy looking kernels, developing kernels, were set. And this is just another photo from Chad in the middle part of the state. And so really, like I said earlier, over the last 10 years, these 3 freeze events, I refuse to say they were a good thing. However, we were able to use them to provide data for producers. What we were able to do is to kind of use Bill Bruning's data and say, okay, at what growth stage did the damage occur? And so in some cases it occurred at stem elongation, which was, Feeks 4 to 5. And then also from week 6 to 9. And so, the growing point was above the ground. And so Bill was very good about writing down whether the visual damage was minor, moderate, or severe. And so over the years, between the western part of the state and the central part of the state, we were able to capture from stem elongation, boot, heading, and flowering damage, spring freeze damage at those times. And you can see that, for instance, for stem elongation, weeks 4 to 9, if you have severe visual damage, you would expect a 0 to 20% yield loss at the end of the year. And so what we did is we kind of looked at, okay, so in years that we had excellent yields, like bin busting years, what was the yield loss? And that would have been 20%. We also looked at years that were absolutely not great growing conditions. And so it wasn't the spring freeze that was necessarily the problem, but other growing conditions may have impacted the yield. And in those years that were bad years for wheat, we had a 0% yield loss. And so if you want specific details on that, please reach out to me, or you can try to read that link at the bottom of this, which provides the reference that for this data. But basically, the beauty of this, I'm trying to say, is that we were able to determine not just a visual damage. So for years and years, we said, okay, minor, moderate, severe loss. But we were able to translate sort of these categorical definitions of spring freeze into numerical estimates of yield loss. You can see it's not surprising that the flowering growth stage, there's no minor or moderate visual damage. It is all severe, because I think that's just the function of the physiology. And so the severe damage equates to 60 to 80% loss. And so I think this gives producers a way to be able to decide what to do with their crop. The other thing with our current weather conditions, not only are we interested in winter temperatures, but what about annual precipitation? Precipitation plays a key role in whether or not we can get our wheat crops harvested or planted, etc. And so what we found is that over the last few years, precipitation has been greater 7 out of the 10 years. And also again, 4 and possibly 5 for 2020, we have made records for the top 10 wettest years on record. And so this is very important when it comes to wheat management, because what happens if we cannot get planted? What do? If we can't plant our fields, then typically what we're going to have is sort of some problems with tillering, right? And so you can see on the top panel, the very nice, lush growth, highly tillered plants that are kind of what we want for overwintering in Kentucky. The bottom panel was planted 3 to 4 weeks later. So how do you mitigate thin stands? It's planted. What do you do now? I mean, at this point, there are some spring mitigations that you can do in terms of nitrogen management, but are there other things that we can do? And so that was something we looked at. I looked at with a PhD student, Catherine. This is her on the planter. And so from about 2007 to 2019, we looked at a study and we were trying to decide, can we mitigate for these stands? So what we did is we looked at in-furrow phosphorus, we looked at different seeding rates, and then of course we had an early to mid-October planting, which was our target, and then we had a mid to late November planting. And honestly, it always was late November. We typically waited until after we got back from Thanksgiving to plant the study. And so what we found in the first year, so in 2017, we had a little bit different treatment set than 2018 and 19, so I'm going to pull those out separate. But in 2017, we had a fantastic year. I mean, we're talking about 100 plus bushel yields. But do you remember this was one of our spring freeze events? and yet we still had phenomenal yields. I'll take it. It's hard to explain as to why that happened, but it happened. And so what we found is that it didn't matter if we had in-furrow phosphorus or not, if we had an October planting or the November planting, we had similar yields. However, in 2018 and 2019, we had more of a normal growing season. We didn't have a spring freeze. We didn't have an ultra warm year like we did in 2017. And what we found is that, of course, not surprisingly, the in-furrow phosphorus didn't do much for us for the October planting. But for the November planting, across all the fields that we looked at, which was 4, we found a 4 bushel increase in yield for the November planting. And so this was really interesting to us, that we possibly found a way to kind of help mitigate these thin stands. But we also wanted to know, that's great, we had increased yield, but what about each year? Was it year in, year out? And so what we looked at was the range, okay? The range and the difference. And so you can see in 2018 on the Crider Silt loam, there was a 0 bushel increase. And then we also had a range of up to 13 bushel increase. And so I want you to stay tuned. We're going to examine this data a little bit further with some other statistical methodologies. What we're going to try to see is the probability of increasing yield with in-furrow phosphorus. And so we're going to look at some different statistical techniques. In addition, we looked at different seeding rates. And so what we found was that if we increase the seeding rate to 56 plants, our target of 56 plants per square foot for the November planting versus our recommended 35, we did increase yield as well. So basically what we found is over the years, Mother Nature can throw a lot of punches at us, whether it be drought, flooding, spring freezes, etc. But we have a toolbox. We have the tools to be able to mitigate these. One of these is now an estimate of yield loss. So we are able to quantitatively determine what the yield loss will be. This is going to allow producers to determine whether or not they can terminate their wheat or they should keep it and it'll be profitable at the end. We also have potentially some tools as well that might help us mitigate thin stands. And so please stay tuned on that. We've got quite a bit more work on that we hope to get out in the next few years. This has been Carrie Knott with the University of Kentucky. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me via email. Also, please follow me on Twitter, and if you need additional resources, please visit our website at kygrains.info. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carrie, for that presentation. We're going to jump right into Edwin's presentation on soil compaction. And just a reminder that when we're through with this presentation as well, on the other side of it, we're going to have a roundtable discussion where all of the speakers will be available. You'll be able to ask all of them questions at that time as well. And so we'll jump right into Edwin's.
Hello, I'm Edwin Ritchie, Extension Soil Specialist located here at Princeton at the UK Research and Education Center. Today I'll be discussing compaction, whether it's limiting yield, and if so, how can it be managed? So what exactly is soil compaction? Soil compaction is a reduction of a volume of soil per given mass. So we're getting a certain amount of soil in a smaller area. With this, we're decreasing soil pore space, which in turn limits gas exchange, water movement, and if severe enough, plant root growth. The particle density, or a mineral's particle density, is about 2.65. The soil bulk density is roughly half that. So an ideal bulk density for a soil in our area is about 1.35 grams per cubic centimeter. So how do we get this? So again, compaction is the amount of soil or a reduction in the volume. So an ideal soil of a bulk density of 1.35, roughly half of it's mineral, a little bit of organic material, and then the rest is pore space for air and water. This is ideal for roots to access the water and air, need good gas exchange. So we have our organic matter, which is the glue that holds these soil mineral particles together. We have these pore spaces here where our water and air is contained. When we reduce that pore space, we're getting these soil mineral particles closer proximity, and we have more minerals and less pore space for air and water. So we have different types and reasons for compaction. A natural kind of compacted layer we have in western Kentucky are frangipans. They're something we're dealt with. We really can't do much with them other than learn best management practices for them. Luckily for wheat production, they're not heavily utilized because of this problem. Soil crust, we're talking about a very small part of overall soil, maybe 1/8 of an inch, and that is due to excessive or intensive tillage and low soil organic matter. No tillage, this really isn't compaction, but we often hear, well, no-till soils are more compacted or have a greater bulk density than no-till. And that's true, but generally they also have greater porosity. So there's more pores for these roots to explore and utilize than the conventionally tilled soils, so it kind of offsets itself. The two I'll be discussing today are sidewall and traffic compaction. So sidewall is when we have smearing and sealing of that soil planter furrow by the opener. It's generally too wet. Same thing with traffic. Too wet, repeated traffic, or heavy axle loads over a certain area. The smaller that tire surface area, the greater the pressure it exerts on the soil. This is a figure that depicts soil compaction with increasing soil moisture. We have our water content on the x-axis, the y-axis has bulk density. Remember, 1.35 is ideal. We have 2.5% moisture, 7.5, 12.5, all the way up to 22.5 and then 27. The pink line is no-till. The dark line above it is tilled. As we increase the soil moisture and compact it to its maximum amount, we increase the bulk density up to a point where it maximizes around 22% moisture, and then it drops off. What we have going on here, as we increase the soil moisture, it allows these soil mineral particles to rearrange themselves, fit closer together, exert or let the air pass out of these pores, and then we compact it up to a point, and then bulk density decreases. The reason for this is we cannot compact water. So what we're doing is squirting actually air out. This would be creating ruts in the field, whereas this would be creating tire tracks. Another interesting part of this is the no-till is always lower bulk density than the conventional till at the same moisture content, and that's due to a 0.5% difference in organic matter. Organic matter not only is the glue that holds the soil mineral particles together, but it's also resistant. It helps soils resist compaction. And finally, I said this is where we create ruts when you get too wet, but where we have the greatest potential for compaction is about the first time you can traffic these soils. When you're at field capacity or when all the free water drains, this is where you're most likely to compete it. So the first day or two you can traffic a field is probably where it has the greatest potential for compaction. How do we determine compaction? Well, by plant growth and root development. That's visual, but we also have some tools. I mentioned bulk density, but a better tool for most producers and researchers would be penetrometer resistance. The penetrometer was invented by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to measure soil strength. We brought it over to agriculture, and it's related to soil bulk density, but what it is a proxy for the root's ability to penetrate soil. The critical value is between 2 and 4 megapascals, or units you're probably more familiar with, 300 or so psi. If we get to 250, 300 psi, we're getting there where we think roots can start to be hindered. Their growth could be slowed by these dense soils. When measuring or determining soil penetrometer resistance, you want to do it where you have a good moist soil. If it's dry, it won't work. You want to make sure that the resistance is actually due to, or the difference in resistance is due to the soil, not soil moisture. Here's a few pictures that show what compacted soils can be. Here's sidewall compaction. The opener allowed the seed to be dropped, but it didn't close it up well. Soil dried out, and you're not getting lateral growth into this planter furrow. Here's some compaction. These corn plants should be the same size. This one's not able to access the soil nutrients below this layer and water. This one is. Same thing here. Pretty much these roots were not able to go downward and access the nutrients and water. This is an example of a soil penetrometer. It has a load cell which measures the amount of resistance it takes to force this rod into the ground. There's increments here every 3 inches, so you can watch your gauge and the depth to determine where that compaction is occurring. Most penetrometers have 2 different size tips, so they have 2 different size scales. Make sure you're utilizing the right one. So when we hit 300 psi, we're saying this potentially can be limiting yield. To determine compaction with the soil penetrometer, like anything, the more samples you can collect, the better off you're going to be. So we again say 300 psi is probably enough to limit yield, but it's not necessarily just one. It's a percentage of those that you take. So Lloyd Murdoch did some work early on, and he determined if 30 to 35% of the psi are greater than 300, you might benefit, but your yield might benefit by doing something. If over half of them are, yeah, you should probably address that compaction. However, if they aren't at 300 psi or greater, you're not going to benefit yield by trying to reduce compaction. And then you want to document where that layer started and where that compacted layer ended. If it started at 4 inches and ended at 7, there's no reason to run a subsoiler to 18 inches. They did another survey in row crop, Kentucky row crop fields, surveyed 210 fields. Over half of them showed little to no compaction. Another 16% were slightly compacted, where they didn't expect to see yield limitations. However, 33% were either moderately or severely compacted, where they to the point would expect to see reductions in yield. And of these fields, when compaction was probably going to limit yield, 80% were poorly drained fields. So again, it comes back to water. This is a picture Dr. Chad Lee took off of Google Earth, and you can see different tracks through here, most likely a grain cart following a combine. But just because you can see tracks doesn't necessarily mean we have compaction. It's hard to tell from a picture if a field's compacted. But what I would do with this picture, you see where the most traffic is, and back here where the most traffic probably occurred for different management operations throughout the season. So those are the areas I would focus. Just because you can see a track through the field doesn't necessarily mean it's compacted or that it might be limiting yield. Look for these heavy trafficked areas. This is most likely where you would find a compaction, or in wet areas of the field. Here's a picture of some tire tracks going through a wheat field, and we found some yellow streaking in these tire tracks. Well, I took my penetrometer out there to measure it. Yes, we had 250 to 300 psi where these tire tracks were, and 200 to 250 psi where there were no tire tracks. Was that limiting yield? It might might be, but it might not be due to compaction or limiting root growth, but rather holding slightly more water, so the available nitrogen that we had was more prone to be lost through denitrification here than in here. So just because you can see something doesn't necessarily mean it is compaction or limiting yield. This is a picture of platy soil, very compacted, had a lot of traffic over this area of the soil. They most likely saw a pretty big benefit from subsoil in this field. So once we've identified compaction, what do? Well, one option is nothing. If it's not severe, over time, freezing and thawing can help to alleviate that compaction. Another thing to do is nothing in a no-till system. Again, Lloyd Murdoch did some work and found that over time, yields improved by doing nothing in this no-till system. These soil pores were able to hold up, roots were able to find them, and over time, it fixed itself. Mild compaction, you might look at a cover crop, whether it be a brassica, a winter annual ryegrass, wheat. But anytime you can get a root to grow into something, that's probably going to help. This is not going to help with severe forms of compaction. Then if it's determined it's pretty severe, you might have to do tillage, whether it be with a chisel plow for shallow or a subsoiler for deeper compaction. Again, you just want to make sure you can get to that depth where the compaction is and a little bit below it. Subsoiling, want to make sure the soil is dry and that it shatters. And this is a high horsepower input operation, so you want to make sure you're doing it for the right reason. These producers did a real good job. You don't want to, remember, tillage or subsoiling is tillage, and you don't want to create another problem by tilling. So maybe we're fighting compaction here, and then we went through this waterway and created erosion. Not a good thing. So remember where to focus that. This picture shows that they actually pulled up some rocks that were better under the surface. Probably didn't need to do all that subsoil in there. Here's what we see in the subsoiler. The no-till and conventional till in these two pictures, the pink was subsoiled, the blue was not. We can see in the no-till, we actually reduced penetrometer resistance with depth, whereas in the conventional till, we didn't. That's right in the subsoiler pass. 20 inches away, there was really no difference. Here's a picture of some radishes or turnips or radishes. They can help in mild situations, not in severe though. Winter annual, if you can get the roots to grow, they're going to do some good. So to wrap it up, the best thing to do is to avoid it. And this is typically when the soil is too wet. Repeated traffic, again, usually when it's too wet, or just high axle loads. We have a lot of heavy equipment now. If you run over the same area multiple times, you're prone to compaction. Remember that surface area, the smaller the surface area per given weight, the more compressive forces you have of those tires. So make sure you properly diagnose compaction where it is, and you diagnose it and treat it at different times. You diagnose it when the soil is moist throughout the profile, and you want to treat it when it is dry so you get good shatter. Develop a plan, and it might not involve subsoiling. But if you do subsoil, make sure you're doing it correctly and focused. And remember, an ounce of prevention will go a long way. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Edwin, for that presentation as well. Folks, that brings us to the roundtable portion of this meeting or field day, as I called it when talking to President Capilouto. And so we'd like for each of the speakers to turn their videos on. If we get bogged down, we may go back to turning videos off, but for now, we'll try that with the speakers with their videos on. And y'all keep looking in the chat box to see if there's some questions coming in there. While we're waiting on those questions to come in, several have come in to me that I'm going to start asking, but I'll pause those if we get some other ones that come into the chat box as well. And so the first one, Matt, this goes to you, and I think you've answered this partly in the chat already, but was there any prediction for temp or rainfall this summer? I was going to joke that Matt gave us the historical perspective of where weather was. And for predictions, that goes into the paid portion of the meeting. But I think Matt already put that up. So Matt, if you would care to address that quickly.
Yeah, and I sent the outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. They are showing higher confidence in above normal temperatures and above normal precip, but that goes along with the climate trends we've seen over the past several years. What I will say, I mean, we are, 6-7 months out. So as you farmers know, please take it with a grain of salt right now. Even those outlooks will get better the closer we get to those summer months. So stay on the lookout, but right now it is trending warmer and wetter again.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Kind of related to that, Matt. One question that came in said the long-term graphs suggest that there's some temperature swings about every 15 years. When you look over the entirety of that graph that you put in over 100 plus years. And so the question is, should we expect this current trend that we're in to last about 15 years?
So for me, it's a little hard to say. We always talk about climate change, and all the climate models are kind of zoning in on a warmer and wetter climate as we move forward here in southeastern Kentucky, or the southeast, I'm sorry. But something I will say is, so I looked at normals from 1981 through 2010. The new normals are set to come out probably. The last time I looked, the last normals came out in July, so we can probably expect them July this year. But it looks like over the past 10 years, we're going to take off the 81 through 90 data set off the last normals, and we're going to add 2011 through 2020. And it looks like precipitation is going to go up about 2.5 inches on those normals. So we're going from our last annual normal of 47.8 or 9 inches on average here in Kentucky to over 50. So quite a significant jump. And the same with temperatures. It's about a half a degree above normal. Sorry, my tongue's getting twisted a little bit, but a half a degree above normal if we take off those 10 years and add the latest 10 years. So yes, I mean, whenever we look at climate change, everything is kind of focusing toward that warmer and wetter trend right now. Ultimately, it is a little harder to definitively say, what it's going to be like in 15, 20 years. But right now, as I was saying, the trend is wetter and warmer.
Well, and if you looked at that, the trend that you put in there where it's showing the increasing temperatures right now, they're a little bit higher than they were the last time we went through one of those trends. And so maybe if there are going to be these ebbs and flows, it may all trend a little bit warmer than it did the last cycle through on that as well, if you look at some of these models longer term. So the follow-up question to that one was, well, does that also mean we get more rainfall during this current 15-year swing? So we've been warmer, but we've also been wetter. And so should we expect that wetter portion to continue? It's one thing for us to be warmer. As long as we're wetter with it, we can do okay with our crops. If it's not, that's a different ballgame. Yeah.
And as I was saying, climate models are trending toward that warmer pattern as we move forward in the years ahead. What I do want to say is, I keep saying it's going to trend warmer, it's going to trend wetter. That's what we've been seeing as of late. As you've seen in the past several years, that doesn't mean we aren't going to have a dry period here and there. We saw it in 2016. We saw it last or two Septembers ago in 2019, where we averaged 0.22 inches. So while we are trending warmer and wetter, we will still have dry periods. We will still have cold periods. And I just want to say, looking at these climate models and everything, they tell us we're going to trend warmer and wetter, but it's not always the case. We're going to see our ups and downs in agriculture. We just got to deal with it. I was talking prior to this presentation I think a big change we've seen in years past is our heavy rainfall events seem more significant.
Mhm.
1-2 inch rainfall events seems like they're happening more often now. And that's something I need to look at. But in regards to precipitation, these climate models are predicting more extreme rainfall events followed by more extended periods of dry conditions. And we haven't had a problem with that in recent years, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. So,
Well, to your point on that, Matt, I would certainly, just personal observation driving around the state and such, the fields that have some type of cover on them right now during the winter, wheat fields and some other fields that have cover crop, they are in much better situation than fields that don't have a wheat crop on them or some other type of a dense cover crop. I see more erosion showing up, even in fields that are no-till, that have some slope to them because of these heavier rain events that we've been dealing with in these winter months. And so, and I guess in my opinion, one more reason, one more check in the positive column for growing wheat in the state as we go through some of these weather extremes. All right, I'll read off the next question I've got, and this one is for Carrie. So Carrie, when you were discussing your in-furrow P fertilizer studies, what were your soil test P values?
Oh, I didn't even think to pull those out. So we did have those analyzed and they were all considered adequate based upon AGR1. So none of them were lacking for P. None of them on the same token were, following a bunch of manures or litters. And so they weren't high either. So they were kind of a moderate range for Kentucky. And so we did not have any expectation that they would do much. So I have to have full disclosure. We were kind of looking into this in furrow to help mitigate some fusarium head blight control. And what we found is that it didn't do anything for fusarium head blight. It didn't help with heading uniformity or reduce head blight incidents. What it did is it seemed to increase tillering early in the season. And so we're kind of following that rabbit hole, Chad, and I kind of alluded to it in my talk, is that we've got some additional studies to follow up on that. And we're going to be investigating additional phosphorus later to see if this trend continues. In furrow versus broadcast, different timings, and we're also going to be looking at some nitrogen too. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does, Carrie. Thank you. I appreciate that. Next question I got that came in goes to Edwin, and it's looking at this issue of compaction. And so Edwin, would controlled traffic be the best way to help mitigate or alleviate or otherwise prevent compaction, particularly talking about this large equipment going across fields?
Controlled traffic would be great if a producer set up for that. It's not really super easy to have everything properly sized. So if you are not sized adequately where you can control your traffic, that's an expensive proposition. But let's just say everything is worked out and you can focus it on, certain passes. Yes, then you can come back and address compaction only in a few areas most years, unless you're planting wet and creating sidewalk compaction. And then, that's not really a whole lot you can do to address that in the field. So yeah, that'd be a great